Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second recap, day 2 of Google I/O. I am joined again, thankfully, he came back, the infamous GDE, Google Developer Expert, and just YouTube sensation, Tadas Petra. How was your second day?
A little bit less stressful than the first one. You know, the way Google set up this one, they let you kind of pick and choose what you wanted to learn. So, I mean, I found that, you know, kind of easy to pick out what exactly you want to watch and schedule it for yourself pretty much for the day. So it was definitely a lot less stressful, and then also got to dig into stuff that I was really curious about.
Yeah, they provided a lot of flexibility this year. It seemed like in years past, you know, obviously whenever it was a physical, you know, an in-person conference, there's time slots that you have to respect in order to be able to go to different sessions. And then even last year, they had those sessions at different time slots. But this year it was just, once it hit 9 a.m. Pacific, it was just the floodgates opened up. And they're like, here's a bunch of technical sessions and workshops. And then, like you said, it's basically choose your own adventure, which is, I think, kind of what we did. We kind of went off on our own paths and you know, looked at different sessions that interest us. And I know I kind of got down a rabbit hole. So I'd watch one session and they'd mention another one inside of that session. So then I'd kind of branch off and go watch that one. I'm curious though, what did you find to be the most exciting or most interesting throughout the day?
So the biggest one I watched was probably Firebase. Since Flutter is like the main thing I use, Firebase is like the one that comes naturally with it. So I wanted to take a look at all the new things that Firebase had. So the couple of cool things announced was they had Firebase extensions. And I got some notes here. So Firebase extension events was what they called it. So these are like you can extend the Firebase extensions that they already have in order to add your custom code in. So they gave some pretty cool examples, like if someone, you know, cancels their subscription using their Stripe API, you can like take that event and add some custom code to it to, you know, do whatever you want. And I actually used the Stripe extension through Firebase before. So having that little like feature, you know, to be able to add on whatever you need, I think will be huge. And then they had a couple other things like making Firebase deployment using the modern web frameworks like Next.js. And I think they mentioned Angular Universal. I've never heard of that, but I think I'm assuming that's like Google's like, you know, modern web framework thing. So that was super cool because I do use Next.js as well. And they announced some Swift support. And then, of course, the big one was the Firebase and Flutter official support. So now you got the Flutter documentation within the actual Firebase documentation. So it's a lot easier. And then when you go into Firebase now, before you had to, you know, add your application, there wasn't a specific like Flutter section. So you had to just go through it and use the Flutter documentation that told you how to go through it. But now using the actual Firebase console to start up your Flutter applications pretty much.
Yeah. That was a theme I thought throughout especially yesterday, whenever they were talking in the developer keynote, and I think maybe even in the main keynote, it seemed like Firebase and Flutter were consistent themes in there. And you can tell that they're really trying to expand both of those. I mean, obviously Firebase is huge. And then, as you said, I mean, being able to use it with Flutter and all these, you know, fully supported integrations is going to be huge. It speaks a lot to, I think, what you were talking about yesterday, which is just, you know, simplifying things and making things a little bit more accessible, which is really cool. And then I think I heard even that they have like better tooling where they're like starting to integrate, you know, Firebase maybe into, you know, different development tools you might use. And then even like Crashlytics and stuff like that are getting integrated into some stuff that I want to talk about with the Play Store a little bit later on. But that's really cool. So did you get to branch out of Flutter, or did you just stick to the Flutter stuff today?
It was the Firebase stuff. I know the exact two things you were talking about too. They mentioned those in the Firebase talks as well. I'll let you get to those. But the other things I checked out were the Google Home. But so it got a little bit too complex for me since I don't necessarily work with Google Home. They mentioned a lot of Matter, I guess, is the big new thing within smart home devices. And it's some sort of standard that they're creating between all the different companies so that your devices can work together. So I thought that would be like, I hope I understood it right, but that seems like that would be a very, very huge thing for like smart homes. Cause I've had, you know, troubles with like little cross-platform smart home stuff. And I mean, yeah, the one they hyped it up, it seemed like it could change like the smart home game.
That's a good point. I mean, you're talking about, I mean, yesterday they were describing some like web standard stuff, being able to kind of standardize that. But I feel like IoT, it's kind of a long time coming for standardization for that, just because I'm the same with you. It seems like anything that uses IoT, or you start to get into like Bluetooth low energy, it's still like the Wild West, which seems crazy to me, because anytime I've had to mess with, Bluetooth, like BLE on mobile or with some IoT devices, I got to say, it's always a massive pain in the ass. Maybe that's just me, but it'll be cool if there is some standardization behind that.
Yeah, me too. And then, just like even the simple things, they mentioned how usually you have to install some different app for every single device, like depending what company it's made for. I guess with the Matter standard, they're going to try to, kind of limit it and make it a little bit easier with that as well. Then other than that, I got into the Flutter stuff, a lot of the Flutter talks. So we talked about the what's new in Flutter session yesterday. A lot of the Flutter talks were just kind of diving deeper on specific topics. So it wasn't necessarily new things there. I think that's what kind of day 2 was mostly about, just, teaching about what they already have. And of course, on top of that, the new stuff too. But in the session that was the coolest one for me, or stuff I kind of knew about, was the Flutter concurrency session. So where they described like Dart isolates, which I have some videos about as well. But they gave some cool use cases of when you should and shouldn't use it. For example, if you're like loading up an image and you want to show a circular progress indicator in your applications, that's probably a good time to use an isolate. Or they had another game where they had an animation that keeps like moving for the whole time you're in the app, but you also want the game logic to execute on the side. So for those type of things, you should set up 2 separate isolates and then have, kind of, it's not really multi-threading, but like kind of multi-threading in Flutter.
Yeah, it sounds like I need to up my Flutter game and maybe watch some of these videos that you have kind of prepping me for some of this stuff. Because these, even as you're talking about it, I'm like, I have no idea what that is, but it does sound very interesting. I mean, and it's cool that you found something that I think that you'd already kind of worked with or even created videos on, and then, they're providing even more information. Because it did seem like throughout this conference that they put a lot of emphasis on best practices.
Yeah.
They've got, I started to get into some Compose stuff, some Jetpack Compose stuff earlier today. I won't get into it now, but that seemed to be a pretty big theme. And I know Jetpack just in general is kind of this idea of a best practice, or being able to kind of abstract stuff and into these libraries and kind of help you out. But it did seem like in other areas that's what Google was trying to do as well.
Yeah, which I think as their tools are getting more and more mature, like that's kind of what that's the part that is weaker, and you want to mature that part as well as the tools, people's skills within the actual environments that they're working with. And the last thing I kind of checked out was the Flutter Web. They kind of explained a deep dive into how it works. So they have they explained that it uses the Skia engine and then translates that code into WebAssembly, and then how that is faster and more efficient than using HTML and CSS, like the way Electron does, I guess. I never use Electron, but what they mentioned in there, that Electron basically takes HTML, CSS and all that and converts it into a desktop app.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, because I think you kind of mentioned Skia, right? And for anybody who doesn't know, that 2D vector drawing library that came out of Google, which is used for all kinds of things. And then of course, obviously the foundation for Flutter. It's fascinating how many use cases that have, how practical that is. And you look at iOS and Android, and some of the stuff where they were talking about live edit for Android, you kind of ripped on it a little bit yesterday, where, Flutter's had, hot reload or, live edit. But I think that's what makes it so easy to do within Flutter, right? Whenever you're kind of rendering things through the canvas, rather than having to rebuild and redo that and kind of worry about ahead of time compilation, just in time compilation, all that stuff. It's fascinating, because it's just as Flutter matures, it's like this big snowball that just gets larger and better, as time goes on. And it does seem like they put some emphasis on the other stuff other than iOS and Android for Flutter, web, and they had some stuff on Linux, and then even talking about, Windows and Mac. it's fascinating because I know web has a ton of potential, but it's had some kind of sore spots in the past from a performance perspective. But it sounds like this was a pretty promising session that you attended.
Yeah, and they did announce a couple of things that I missed yesterday, but there were like very little improvements in performance in the web, and then like some little tooling that they added to Mac OS, like where you could actually use the title bar of your Mac computer to have some access to that, so you could add things that you need in there. So little things like that, and it just keeps making Flutter better and better every release.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things I think that came out of this was a heavy emphasis on Flutter. I started off really with, and kind of mentioned that, in the second day, they opened up the technical sessions, they opened up the workshops, but between the two longer keynotes yesterday and trying to get into some of the more development keynotes towards the end of the day, I kind of missed some of these other keynotes in there. And one that I wanted to look at, and it was really the first thing that I dove into, was what's new with Google Play, which kind of, I guess, maybe sounds a little boring whenever, just from the outside of it. But, with working in, mobile DevOps and CI/CD, whether you're working in an iOS app or whether you're working in, Google or an Android application, eventually you want to put that thing in a store of some sort. And so those integrations can matter. So really it was mainly just looking at how much more complex is stuff going to be, was the back of my mind. Like, are they going to bump the complexity of trying to deploy an application to Google Play? But that didn't really be it wasn't really the case. It seemed like they focused on three main areas. There was security, kind of privacy and security. They focused on app quality, and then the business success portion, which I started to glaze over a little bit on business success because I was really more interested in security and the app quality portions of it. But some things that I found interesting in there was that they already had something called the SDK console, which allows you basically to get warnings and prompts and basically just keep tabs on the SDKs that you may be using within your applications. But they introduced something called the Google Play SDK Index. And basically it lists all the SDKs that, and I'm struggling to remember the details here, but I think like the SDKs basically sign up for this, right? To be inside of this listing of this index. And then you can go and check out, the different stats and metrics, that things like performance and compatibility for different versions of an SDK, which I think is interesting because if you're thinking about, switching up your application and then trying to use this new SDK, it would be good to get like, how is this thing performing just in general? I think that's how, if I understood it correctly, that's how you can go look at it. But is this thing like, is it a real cluster for different applications out there? And if it is, then maybe I don't want to use it my own. So I thought that was pretty interesting. From an app quality perspective, they really dug into something called Android Vitals, which is basically just looking at technical quality based metrics. So in my notes, I've kind of got some things in here which it looked at like stability metrics, performance metrics, battery usage, and permission denials. So basically being able to kind of integrate with Play and keep tabs on, the vitals within your application. And that was already released, but something that was new that kind of built off that was being able to expose it as an API, which I didn't know wasn't the case beforehand, which was really cool because you can basically access those vitals. So any of the stability, performance, battery metrics, from your application, you can actually access that outside of Google Play now through the API, and allows you to look at like crash and ANR rates, clusters, stack traces, a bunch of really cool stuff that I thought was really cool. And then as we were talking about before with Firebase, it kind of had within the Android Vitals section, they've got this whole integration with Crashlytics and being able to link your Play app. So any application inside of Google Play, you can basically link that with your Crashlytics app, so you don't have to like switch between platforms in order to check that out. I thought that was pretty cool. I mean, it kind of goes in this whole theme or this whole vein of being able to consolidate or simplify things. I thought that was pretty interesting. And then the third part of that session, I glazed over a little bit because it started to get into pricing improvements and pricing tiers, subscriptions, stuff like that. And since I've never really made an app personally that I've made money on, which is probably why I should pay attention to the pricing stuff that's on, the Play Store. But they had some really cool, like, different ways that you could have, subscription models and stuff like that, and be able to change it up. And then they also talked about one of the new features is in-app messaging. So you can basically try to prevent subscriber loss. Like if somebody lapses on a payment or something like that, or isn't paid, you can basically automate these like in-app messages by using this SDK in order to be able to do it. I thought that was kind of cool. If I, had the gumption to create something that I could actually make money on, that would be pretty nice.
Yeah.
But other than that, I mean, I jumped a little bit into so I kind of kept it with this Android theme today, just trying to see, what all was new, because they were pretty abstract about what exactly was new. I mean, I know that Android 13 has been, from a beta perspective, it's been kind of known what's in there, but they didn't really spend a lot of time really talking about that. And of course, beta 2 was released officially yesterday. And I think Android 13 is going to be released sometime like stable in August or something like that this year. But I wanted to jump in a little bit to the keynote. And really, I found that the keynotes, and we were talking about this a little bit before, is that the keynotes are set up in a way, or at least the Android one was, it's set up in a way where it kind of highlights other sessions to jump into. And I thought that was kind of cool. They hit the high points of it, and it helped me determine that I know nothing about Jetpack Compose, just Jetpack in general. And so I use that as an excuse then to just be like, okay, well, I'm going to dive down this rabbit hole to be able to check out, what is really new with Jetpack. And, they spent the first part of the what's new in Jetpack, which is another keynote. So I basically just kept it all keynote up to this point, kind of going through chronologically here. But they, like you said before, I mean, they spent quite a bit of time talking about just improvements to existing libraries. So like Room and paging and navigation, and these library abstractions that just make it easier to do things. They just talked about, new Kotlin, compatibility, or being able to, support Kotlin 1.6. They had new versions of the different libraries. But one thing I found was interesting is that they consistently talked about how these libraries were being rewritten in Kotlin. And it seems to be this kind of trend that Google is taking to just like really double down on Kotlin, which I know is something that they've been doing, but I hadn't realized how pervasive that was until you get into some of these sessions and they talked about, being able to rewrite. And then from a new perspective, they had something called Jank Stats, which is a new Jetpack library, which basically allows you to track and analyze jank, which is dropped rendering frames. So any kind of, frame UI issues that you've got, it allows you to be able to see the stats on that, which is cool, I think, and I also think it's probably something that would be very specific to Android, because that seems pretty common when you've got like all these device ranges, some of them from the Stone Age, that are having some really hard times really rendering some of these modern applications. I think that could be pretty interesting. And then it jumped into Jetpack Compose. Which really just piqued my interest, because I don't really have experience with Jetpack, and especially with Jetpack Compose and the idea of composables. But they had all these new features in it, as nested scrolling interoperability. They had downloadable fonts. So instead of basically just having to use the default fonts or having to bundle them yourselves, they have all these like downloadable fonts that you can just start using with Compose 1.2, and be able to start using just immediately. Without having to take all those extra steps. They had lazy layouts for grids, custom layouts. They talked about the tooling, and I know we talked about this a little bit even today and yesterday, but the live edit, really pushing the live edit, which I think is pretty cool. Compose animation preview, but it kind of piqued my interest, where I thought, well, I need to take a step back, and I actually started to look into the workshop. So they have a basic layout in Compose, and it just walked through all the process of being able to create composables, really describing what composables are. And then in the live coding session that kind of aligned with it, so they had a technical session and they have a workshop you can work through yourself. It allowed you to get in to look at like modifiers, alignments, lazy layouts, material components, and it was really helpful. And you mentioned it too, is that some of these technical sessions, like some stuff, and some of these things are newer, and they had a really good way of just kind of flowing through them to get you to understand it. And I thought that it was built off really well, because during the entire time they're kind of peppering in like, oh, once you get done with this, head to this session to check out, like, one of them is on state. I haven't gotten to watch it yet, but they're talking about state management with Jetpack. And I thought, well, that could be really interesting as well. But I unfortunately didn't get to it. But the last session, and I'll shut up after this, is one that I found really interesting, was the Android development tools. And I know there's probably some people out there like, man, Android development tools, like, you pick the most boring sessions to go to. But I did think it was, I wanted to, see what was really new with Android Studio. They had kind of said some stuff yesterday, during the developer keynote. But one thing that I thought was really interesting is, rather than focus on features this past year, what they've been doing is they've been doubling down on quality and just being able to, improve the quality, but then also like the stability of Android Studio. And they've done that by the claim that they had was they fixed over 1,600 bugs. And I think it was like 15 memory leaks or something like that they found, which is kind of crazy that it's in there. I guess it makes sense, but 1,600 bugs is a lot, to be able to just to crank through. And then they went through, some of the releases they had, like Bumblebee and Chipmunk earlier this year. They got into Dolphin beta, but the most interesting, I think, was Electric Eel on the Canary channel. So I think it's available now, the Canary and dev channels. And they got into, more things about live edit, some of the things about like device mirroring and composing multiple previews. So the things that we saw yesterday, they got a little bit more in depth of how you would actually use that within Android Studio. I thought that was fascinating. Some stuff I don't know if I'd necessarily use as much as other stuff, but it does seem like Electric Eel is the release that is coming up. It's going to have like more feature heavy stuff. So they've kind of made a shift from just the quality and stability stuff. And then I have to admit, after that, and I probably could have gotten into some more sessions, but I think I messaged you earlier today, and I spent more time than I'd like to admit inside of that IO adventure game, which I don't know if you got a chance to play that, but it's kind of like got that whole Animal Crossing, like old school Zelda vibe, where you're kind of walking around, and they've got, you can pick up different like virtual swag, and then be able to check out, different blog posts. You can go up to a board and read one, or check out different videos. But I thought that was fun. I didn't get a chance to check it out last year, and I thought that was a really interesting way to kind of do that. I don't know if you got a chance to look at that at all.
I hopped into it for like just I think like 2 minutes or something, because they wanted to take a Flutter GDE picture with everybody, and so they sent like cool. A location. I logged in real quick, took the picture, but then I was busy, so I had to leave right away. But I mean, all the stuff you mentioned, like, even though I'm not an Android developer, like, and I don't even use Android Studio, like especially the app insights part. I don't know if I remember if you mentioned that, but that one was like, I mean, that's just like a whole nother level of being able to do more and more within one IDE, right? And I think that's like, that could be very, very useful, because you're like, you don't have to be context switching to, different websites, and then you get distracted maybe by Twitter or something if you go to your Firebase console, and then your whole day is like ruined. But here you get to stay within your IDE, you can get your work done. I think that's super cool. Maybe I'll finally switch back to Android Studio. But now that knowing that they had like 1,600 bugs, like maybe they didn't find all of them, because before we used to run.
Yeah, that's a good point, because it's like, well, you have 1,600. How many are there total?
Yeah,
it's one thing if you don't give that baseline. Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, one of the themes that, as you bring that up, one of the themes I think throughout the last couple of days was really consolidation, really simplification. And then the other thing that I felt that was actually pretty pervasive as I went through different sessions that I didn't mention was this whole multi-device. Yeah. They're really pumping using Chrome OS, using tablets. Foldables were really big. They have different sessions that I want to jump into that talk about foldables, and then the wearable stuff using Wear OS as well. I don't know if you saw that much in the stuff that you were looking at, but it seemed like a pretty pervasive theme throughout, is this whole multi-device thing.
I mean, Flutter is all about multi-device. So they definitely talked about all that stuff in there too. But yeah, I agree. Like the whole theme of Google I/O is, I feel like the whole theme of what Google is doing now is that they have all these tools. Now they're just trying to make them as quality and as easy to use to get more and more people, using them and building cool stuff. And I think like it maybe won't be as flashy of headlines. I mean, I guess like the Pixel and the hardware was definitely flashy headlines, but in terms of the software they have, maybe it's not necessarily the most flashy headlines, but they're for me, that's very interesting, and just keeps going to that next step of making it easier and easier to build whatever you want.
Yeah, and I guess that's really the point too, right? Is it? At least what we'd be after is just making our lives easier. I'm sure just being in developer relations, you're just trying to make somebody else's life easier all the time. That's really, it's nice that Google is doing the same thing, trying to come out with, different features and functionalities. They don't necessarily just go for that, big whiz bang, flash and awe, but they're, focusing on quality and stability and, the multi-device and kind of investing in things that they've already established. And it's almost like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They're like bringing them all together now, as the Avengers. So you can use this, these different approaches for all these different devices and stuff. But that's cool, man. Well, day 2 has been a whirlwind. In fact, the whole event, I think, has been just a whirlwind. They kind of crammed it into 2 days. There's no way that we really could have gotten through everything. I know I'm going to be going back and I actually did look up the URL this time. It's io.google/2022. For anybody who's interested out there, they're going to keep all that, really great content up. I think they'll probably bring down the adventure game just because, they won't have as many people in there, but all the rest of the keynotes, the, on-demand technical sessions, even the workshops will all be out there. So I'm excited to jump into it. Tadas, I'll give you the last word on this. Anything that you want to say, any final thoughts on Google I/O 2022 this year?
Oh yeah, just to mention that, like, maybe you don't even need to go through all of that. There's going to be on YouTube and everywhere when you're going into that topic. Google's definitely the best resource to talk about Google. So these are all going to be useful for the years to come, probably. And that Google I/O is great, and I can't wait to see what they do next year.
Yeah, and I do know a guy that does some pretty kick-ass Flutter videos. This guy Tadas. Yeah, so there's other places, like you said, that you can get a lot of this really cool content. I'm sure it's probably inspired you to create some content on some of the stuff that you saw as well. So yeah, for anybody out there, make sure that you follow Tadas and see what he's up to. And I just want to thank everybody for watching these last 2-day recaps, and hopefully you'll get into the rest of the sessions, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Bye.